Welcome. You found a quiet corner of the evening, a place where history moves slowly and gently the way it should. So settle into a comfortable position. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you, and allow the day you've just lived to drift a little further away with every breath. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing left to do except listen. Take one slow breath in and let it go even more slowly. Good. Tonight we travel to the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, to a city built on pale limestone and golden sand, where the desert meets the water, and where, for a few centuries, humanity gathered nearly everything it had ever written down into a single, quiet building beside the harbor. We will walk through the streets of ancient Alexandria as the lamps are lit at dusk, past scribes bent over papyrus, past ships being searched not for treasure but for books, and into a library that once held the memory of the ancient world. There is no need to remember any of it. You only need to listen and let it carry you toward sleep. If these quiet journeys through history help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe so that we can wander through more evenings like this one together. For now, let your eyes close if they haven't already. Our journey begins on the northern coast of Egypt in the year 331 before our era, when a young conqueror first looked upon a strip of land between the sea and a shallow lake, and decided that a city should rise there. Long before the library existed, before a single scroll had been placed on a single shelf, there was only a stretch of coastline, quiet and unremarkable, where the Nile's fresh waters met the salt of the Mediterranean. To the ancient Egyptians who had lived along the river for thousands of years already, this particular strip of land was known by a much smaller name, a fishing village called Rhacodes. It sat near a natural harbor formed by a long limestone island just offshore, an island the Greeks would later call Pharos. Behind the coast lay Lake Merodes, a wide, calm body of brackish water connected to the Nile by canals. And beyond that, the endless green fields of the Nile Delta, fed every year by the river's gentle floods. It was here, in the winter of 331 BCE, that Alexander the Great arrived. He was still a young man, not yet 30, already the ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to the edges of Persia. And he had come to Egypt not as a conqueror in the harsh sense, but almost as a liberator. Egypt had been under Persian rule, and the Persians were not well loved there. The Egyptian priests, it is recorded by ancient historians, welcomed Alexander without significant resistance. He was crowned in the old manner at Memphis, given the titles of pharaoh, and treated, at least symbolically, as the rightful heir to a very old civilization. It was during this visit that Alexander is said to have walked the coastline near Rhacodes and recognized something valuable in its geography. The place had fresh water nearby, protection from the sea by the island of Pharos, a natural harbor deep enough for large ships, and a climate that avoided the worst of the Nile's summer flooding. Ancient sources, including the historian Arrian writing centuries later, describe Alexander personally marking out the boundaries of the new city himself, tracing its main streets in the sand. Though historians today treat such vivid details with some caution, since they were written down long after the events themselves, and blend admiration with legend. What can be said with more confidence, based on archaeological evidence and the consistent testimony of multiple ancient writers, is that Alexander did order a new city built here, and that he gave it his own name, Alexandria. He would never see the city completed. Alexander left Egypt shortly after, continuing his campaigns eastward, and he would die 8 years later in Babylon, far from the coastline he had chosen. The task of actually building Alexandria fell to others, and history has a quiet fondness for what happened next, because the person who took charge of Egypt after Alexander's death was one of his own generals, a man named Ptolemy. Let us slow down here for a moment, because it is worth understanding who this man was, since everything that follows in our story depends on him. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, had served alongside Alexander for years, present at many of his battles, trusted enough to be given a share of the vast territory that fell apart after Alexander's sudden death. When the empire was divided among the generals, Ptolemy chose Egypt. Some historians believe this was a deliberate and wise decision, since Egypt was wealthy, defensible, and somewhat separated from the constant warfare that consumed the rest of Alexander's former empire. Whatever his reasoning, Ptolemy settled into Egypt, and within a few years declared himself king, founding a dynasty that would rule the country for nearly 300 years. While the political maneuvering unfolded across the wider Mediterranean world, the city of Alexandria itself grew, slowly and steadily, according to a careful plan. Unlike many ancient cities that had developed organically over centuries, growing in whatever direction convenience allowed, Alexandria was designed from its very beginning with wide, straight streets set in a grid, a layout historians attribute to the influence of Greek city planning traditions, particularly the ideas associated with the architect Dinocrates, who is credited by some ancient sources with the city's design, though the details of his exact involvement remain debated among scholars. The main street of the city, which the Greeks called the Canopic Way, ran east to west and was wide enough, according to later descriptions, for chariots to pass one another with ease. It stretched for miles, lined eventually with columns and public buildings, connecting one end of the city to the other. A second great avenue crossed it, running from the harbor southward toward Lake Merodes. Where these two roads met became the symbolic heart of the city, a place of markets, temples, and eventually government buildings. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Alexandria's geography, and the one that would shape the city's identity for centuries, was its relationship to the sea. The island of Pharos, once separated from the mainland by open water, was connected to the city by a long causeway called the Heptastadion, named for its length of 7 stadia, an ancient unit of measurement. This causeway effectively created 2 separate harbors on either side, one facing east and one facing west, allowing Alexandria to manage an enormous volume of maritime traffic. Ships could come from across the Mediterranean, from Greece, from Phoenicia, from Rhodes and Cyprus, and eventually from Rome itself, and dock safely in one of these 2 protected harbors. It is worth pausing here to imagine what daily life might have felt like in this new city during its earliest decades, when it was still being built. Egyptian laborers, skilled in generations of building along the Nile, worked alongside Greek settlers who had come seeking opportunity in this new Ptolemaic kingdom. The population was, from its very beginning, remarkably mixed. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and people from across the eastern Mediterranean settled in different quarters of the growing city, each community maintaining its own customs, languages, and religious practices, while still participating in the shared economic and civic life of Alexandria as a whole. This kind of layered, multicultural community was somewhat unusual for its time, and it would remain one of Alexandria's defining characteristics throughout its history. The climate along this stretch of coast was gentler than much of Egypt further south. Sea breezes moderated the heat, and the presence of fresh water from the Nile, carried by canal into the city and into Lake Merodes, meant that Alexandria never suffered the harsh aridity of the deeper desert. Gardens could be grown. Fish were plentiful, both from the sea and from the lake. Grain, grown abundantly in the fertile Nile Delta just beyond the city, could be brought in easily by boat, making Alexandria one of the best supplied cities of the ancient world, a place where famine was rare, even when other regions suffered. As the city took shape through the final decades of the 4th century BCE, Ptolemy I, now firmly established as ruler of Egypt, began to think beyond simple governance. He had spent much of his life in the company of philosophers and thinkers, a common feature of Macedonian court life, where royal children were often educated by prominent scholars. Ptolemy himself may have studied under Aristotle at some point, in the broader circle of students that Alexander himself had also been part of, though the precise details of Ptolemy's education remain uncertain in the historical record. What is clear is that Ptolemy valued knowledge, valued scholarship, and saw in it something worth investing the resources of his new kingdom toward. It was from this inclination, this quiet appreciation for learning that had been shaped by his years alongside Alexander and within Macedonian court culture, that the idea for something greater than a simple royal library began to take form. Ptolemy imagined not merely a room of scrolls for his own private reading, but an institution, a gathering place for scholars, a center where the accumulated knowledge of the known world might be collected, studied, and expanded upon. This idea would not fully take shape until later in his reign, and some historians believe the project was only truly realized under his son. But the seed of it, the ambition behind it, belonged to Ptolemy the First. As this segment draws toward its close, imagine the city of Alexandria as it might have appeared in its earliest years, still smelling of fresh-cut limestone and new mortar. Its wide streets, not yet worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Its harbor beginning to fill with merchant ships from across the Mediterranean world. The sun would have set slowly over Lake Merodes in the evenings, painting the water gold, while lamps were lit one by one along the Canopic Way. Somewhere in this growing, hopeful city, in a quarter that would later be called the Bruchion, near the royal palace complex overlooking the eastern harbor, the first plans for a great center of learning were beginning to form in the mind of an aging general who had once walked beside Alexander himself. In our next segment, we will follow those plans as they grow into something real. As Ptolemy and, in time, his son begin to build not just a library, but an entire community of scholars, in a place the Greeks would come to call the Museion, the very origin of our modern word museum. Let your breathing continue to slow. Let your body continue to settle as we move gently forward into the story of how the Library of Alexandria came to be, as Alexandria settled into its early decades, and as Ptolemy the First grew more secure in his rule over Egypt. The idea that had first taken root in his mind began, slowly, to become something real. Historians generally agree that the actual founding of what would become the library, and its companion institution, the Museion, happened either very late in Ptolemy the First's reign or early in the reign of his son, Ptolemy the Second, who took the name Philadelphus. The precise date remains uncertain, and ancient sources disagree slightly on the details. But most modern historians place the true beginnings of the institution somewhere around 295 to 285 BCE. The word Museion, from which we get our modern word museum, did not originally mean a building full of old objects for public viewing, as it does today. In the Greek world, a museion was a shrine or sacred space dedicated to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of poetry, music, history, dance, and the arts and sciences more broadly. Such spaces had existed before Alexandria, most notably in Athens, where philosophical schools like Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum had operated for generations as gathering places for teachers and students, structured loosely around communal life and shared inquiry. Ptolemy, drawing on this tradition, envisioned something similar for Alexandria, but on a far grander and more organized scale, backed by the resources of an entire kingdom, rather than the more modest means of a private philosophical school. The man most closely associated with actually organizing this vision into reality was Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian statesman and philosopher who had once governed Athens itself before political upheaval forced him into exile. Demetrius arrived in Alexandria, and according to ancient sources, including the geographer Strabo, played a significant role in advising Ptolemy on the establishment of the library and its collection. It is worth noting that some later sources attribute even more sweeping influence to Demetrius than modern historians are entirely comfortable confirming, since much of what we know about him comes from accounts written well after his lifetime. Still, the general picture that a learned advisor helped shape the early library's mission and scope is widely accepted. The Museion itself, once established, was not merely a library in the way we might imagine one today, a quiet room of shelves. It was closer to what we might now call a research institute, or perhaps an early university, though even that comparison requires some care, since ancient institutions did not always map neatly onto modern categories. Scholars invited to the Museion were given housing, meals, and a stipend, all paid for by the royal treasury, allowing them to dedicate themselves entirely to study, teaching, and writing without the burden of earning a separate living. This arrangement, remarkable for its time, attracted brilliant minds from across the Greek-speaking world, drawn by the promise of resources and freedom that few other places could offer. The complex, based on descriptions from ancient writers and some archaeological inference, likely included covered walkways for walking and conversation, a communal dining hall where scholars ate together, lecture halls, and gardens, possibly including a small menagerie of animals and botanical specimens gathered for study. Since natural philosophy, the ancient precursor to what we now call science, was deeply interested in observing the living world directly. Whether every detail of these descriptions is entirely accurate remains a matter of ongoing archaeological and historical inquiry, since the exact physical layout of the Museion has never been definitively located by excavation. Much of ancient Alexandria having been built over, submerged, or otherwise lost to time. Attached to, or very near, the Museion stood the library itself, sometimes referred to in ancient sources as the Great Library, though this exact phrase appears to be more of a later, informal description than an official name used at the time. The building would have housed the growing collection of scrolls, primarily written on papyrus, a material made from the pith of a plant that grew abundantly along the Nile. Papyrus had been used in Egypt for writing for thousands of years already by this point, and Alexandria, situated so close to its primary source, had easy and abundant access to this essential material. Another quiet advantage of the city's geography that supported its growth into a center of writing and scholarship. Now let us consider gently how such a vast collection of written works actually came to fill the library's shelves, because this part of the story reveals a great deal about the ambitions of the Ptolemaic kings and the era they lived in. The goal, according to several ancient sources, was nothing less than the complete collection of all the world's books, or at least everything considered worth preserving in the Greek intellectual tradition. along with significant efforts to translate important works from other cultures into Greek. One of the most famous outcomes of this ambition was the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a project that produced what became known as the Septuagint, according to a later account preserved in a document called the Letter of Eratosthenes. Ptolemy the Second commissioned 70 or 72 Jewish scholars to travel to Alexandria and translate the Torah into Greek for inclusion in the library's collection. Modern historians treat many of the specific details in this letter with considerable caution, since it was likely written generations after the events it describes and contains elements that read more like a legend meant to celebrate the greatness of the translation than a strict historical record. What does appear to be true, based on broader evidence, is that a Greek translation of Jewish scripture was indeed produced in Alexandria during this general period, reflecting the city's genuine role as a meeting point between Greek and Jewish intellectual traditions. Beyond such singular, celebrated projects, the more ordinary work of building the collection involved a steady, patient accumulation of texts from across the known world. Ptolemaic agents were reportedly sent to book markets in cities like Athens and Rhodes, tasked with purchasing entire libraries when possible, or individual valuable scrolls when whole collections could not be acquired. Wealthy individuals across the Mediterranean world, understanding the prestige associated with contributing to the library's collection, sometimes sold or donated their personal libraries to Alexandria. Perhaps the most well-known and most debated method of collection involved the ships that docked in Alexandria's busy harbors. According to ancient sources, including a scholar named Galen, writing much later, ships arriving in Alexandria's port were searched for scrolls and books. Any texts found aboard were confiscated, and scribes working for the library would produce careful copies. In some versions of this account, the original scrolls were kept for the library's collection, while the copies, rather than the originals, were returned to the ship's owners. This practice sometimes referred to using a Greek phrase that translates roughly to describe the origin of confiscated books, illustrates the lengths to which the Ptolemaic administration was willing to go in pursuit of a truly comprehensive collection. Historians today generally accept that some version of this practice likely occurred, given that it is mentioned in multiple ancient sources, though the exact scale and consistency of the policy remains difficult to verify precisely, and some of the more dramatic details may have grown somewhat exaggerated with retelling over the centuries. Let us slow down here and imagine what this process might have actually looked like, day to day, in the quiet, patient work of the library's scriptorium, the room or rooms where scribes sat copying texts by hand. A scribe would work at a low table, papyrus scroll unrolled before him. a fresh blank scroll beside it, dipping a reed pen into ink made from soot and gum, carefully forming the Greek letters column by column, matching the line breaks of the original as closely as possible, since ancient scholars valued textual accuracy and were already, even at this early stage, developing methods for comparing different copies of a text to identify errors and variations. This work required patience, a steady hand, and genuine literacy, a skill possessed by a relatively small portion of the ancient population, making the scribes themselves valued and respected members of the library's community. The scale of the eventual collection, though impossible to state with complete precision, was almost certainly enormous for its time. Ancient sources offer various figures, some claiming the library eventually held several 100,000 scrolls, with certain accounts suggesting numbers as high as 400,000 or even beyond. Modern historians treat these specific numbers with appropriate caution, since ancient authors were not always precise or consistent in their record keeping, and later writers sometimes repeated or inflated earlier claims. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the library's collection was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily large, likely the largest single collection of written texts that had ever been assembled up to that point in human history. It is worth remembering, as we drift gently through this part of the story, that a single scroll did not typically contain an entire work in the way a modern book might. Longer texts, such as Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, were divided across multiple scrolls, meaning that the number of individual physical scrolls in the library's collection likely represented a somewhat smaller number of distinct literary or scholarly works, though still an impressively large and diverse body of knowledge, covering poetry, drama, history, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, geography, and philosophy, gathered from Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Babylonian, and other intellectual traditions across the known world. As this segment settles toward its close, picture the early library in these formative years, its shelves slowly filling, scroll by scroll, scribe by scribe, under the patient direction of scholars who had come from across the Mediterranean to build something that had never quite existed before. A single place where humanity's collective memory might be gathered and preserved. Outside, the city of Alexandria continued to grow around this quiet, scholarly heart, its harbors busy with ships, its markets full of merchants, its wide streets filled with the ordinary rhythms of daily life. In our next segment, we will step outside the library's walls and walk through the wider city itself, exploring how ordinary Alexandrians lived, worked, and rested in the shadow of this great center of learning. Let us step away from the library for a while and walk instead through the wider city that surrounded it, because a place as remarkable as the library did not exist in isolation. It grew from and was sustained by the ordinary rhythms of a busy, living city, filled with people who, for the most part, never set foot inside its scholarly halls, yet whose daily labor, trade, and community life made such an institution possible in the first place. Imagine, for a moment, the city waking at dawn. Alexandria's mornings would have begun early, as they did in most ancient Mediterranean cities, with the cooler hours before the sun grew high being the most productive time for work. Bakers would already be at their ovens, since bread, made from wheat grown in the fertile fields of the Nile Delta, formed the foundation of the ordinary Alexandrian diet. Fishermen would be returning from the harbor with the night's catch, since both the sea and Lake Merodes provided a steady and varied supply of fish, an important part of the local diet alongside bread, olive oil, and whatever vegetables and fruits were in season, including dates, figs, onions, and lentils. The population of Alexandria during the height of its prosperity, under the early Ptolemaic kings, is estimated by historians to have reached several 100,000 people, though precise figures from antiquity are, as with so much else from this period, difficult to establish with certainty. What is clear from both archaeological evidence and the writings of ancient visitors is that Alexandria was, by the standards of its time, an enormous and cosmopolitan city, rivaling and eventually surpassing many of the older cities of the Greek world in size and wealth. The city's population reflected this cosmopolitan character in a way that shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Greek settlers, many of whom had come to Egypt seeking opportunity under Ptolemaic rule, formed a significant portion of the population, particularly among the wealthier and more educated classes. Native Egyptians, whose ancestors had lived along the Nile for millennia before Alexander ever arrived, made up a large portion of the laboring population, working as farmers in the surrounding countryside, as craftsmen within the city, and in countless other occupations that kept Alexandria functioning. A substantial Jewish community, one of the largest outside of Judea itself, settled in a specific quarter of the city, maintaining its own religious and communal institutions, while also participating actively in the broader civic and economic life of Alexandria. This layered diversity meant that a walk through Alexandria's streets would have exposed a visitor to a genuine mixture of languages, with Greek serving as the primary administrative and literary language, while Egyptian, in its Demotic written form, continued to be used, particularly among the native population, and in matters of local religious and legal tradition. Aramaic and Hebrew would have been heard in the Jewish quarter, and travelers passing through the busy harbors brought still more languages from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Let us walk gently along the Canopic Way, the great east-west avenue that formed the spine of the city, wide enough for chariots and carts to pass comfortably, lined eventually with columns and public buildings. This street would have been filled during the day with a steady flow of foot traffic, merchants calling out from their shops, and the general hum of urban commerce. Alexandria's markets offered goods from across the known world, a natural consequence of its position as one of the Mediterranean's most important trading ports. Grain, Egypt's most valuable export, was shipped out in enormous quantities, feeding not only other parts of the Mediterranean world, but eventually, under Roman rule, contributing significantly to feeding the city of Rome itself. In exchange, Alexandria's harbors received goods from across the ancient trading world: wine from Greek islands, olive oil, fine pottery, textiles, and increasingly luxury goods brought by longer trade routes stretching toward India and the Arabian Peninsula. Since Alexandria's position also made it a natural hub, connecting Mediterranean trade with routes running down the Red Sea, spices, incense, and other exotic goods passed through Alexandria's markets, adding to the sensory richness of the city's commercial life, filling the air near certain districts with unfamiliar and pleasant scents. Craftsmen of many kinds worked throughout the city, their workshops often clustered by trade in particular districts, following patterns common to many ancient cities. Potters shaped clay into vessels for cooking, storage, and trade. Weavers produced linen from flax grown in the Nile Delta, as well as finer textiles for wealthier customers. Glassmakers and Alexandria became particularly renowned in later centuries for the quality of its glasswork, shaped molten glass into vessels and decorative items that were traded across the Mediterranean world. Metalworkers crafted tools, jewelry, and household items from bronze, iron, silver, and occasionally gold, depending on the wealth of their clientele. Family life in Alexandria, as in much of the ancient Mediterranean world, centered around the household, though the structure and daily rhythms of that household life varied considerably depending on a family's wealth, ethnicity, and social status. Wealthier Greek and Ptolemaic elite families lived in larger homes, sometimes built around an open central courtyard in a style adapted from Greek architectural traditions, providing light, air, and a private outdoor space shielded from the busy streets outside. Poorer families, both Greek and Egyptian, lived in more modest housing, often smaller apartments or single-room dwellings in denser residential districts, a pattern common across most ancient cities where wealth inequality shaped nearly every aspect of daily living conditions. Children in Alexandria, particularly boys from families of sufficient means, might receive an education that reflected the city's scholarly reputation. Though it is important to remember that formal education of this kind remained a privilege unavailable to the majority of the population, particularly the poor, and, in most cases, girls, whose education, when it occurred at all, tended to focus more narrowly on skills related to household management, though there is some evidence that at least a portion of Alexandrian women, particularly among wealthier families, achieved genuine literacy, and, in some documented cases, engaged in scholarly or literary pursuits themselves. A fact worth remembering since ancient intellectual life, while dominated by men, was not entirely without women's participation and contribution. Religious life in Alexandria reflected the same layered diversity found throughout the city's population. Traditional Egyptian religious practices continued much as they had for centuries, with temples dedicated to gods such as Isis and Osiris, maintaining their ancient rituals and priesthoods. The Ptolemaic rulers, recognizing the importance of Egyptian religious tradition to their legitimacy as pharaohs, actively supported these temples and their practices, even while personally maintaining Greek religious customs as well. A notable religious development unique to Alexandria was the promotion of the god Serapis, a deity deliberately created or significantly reshaped under Ptolemaic patronage, blending elements of Egyptian and Greek religious tradition in a way that historians believe was intended, at least in part, to help unify the city's diverse population under a shared religious symbol. A great temple to Serapis, known as the Serapeum, was built in Alexandria and would, in time, become one of the city's most significant religious and cultural sites. A place we will return to later in our story, as afternoon settled over the city and the heat of the day grew more pronounced. The pace of Alexandrian life would naturally slow. Wealthier residents might retreat indoors, into the cooler shade of courtyard homes, while others continued their work in shops and workshops, until the cooler hours of early evening returned. As the sun began its descent toward the western harbor, painting the water in shades of amber and rose, the city's rhythms would shift once more toward the quieter, more social hours of the evening, when families gathered for meals, and when, in wealthier households, guests might be invited for conversation, music, or the kind of intellectual discussion that Alexandria, because of its library and its Museion, had become particularly known for across the Mediterranean world. It is worth pausing here gently to consider how remarkable this must have felt to those who lived through it. This quiet, steady rhythm of ordinary life unfolding beneath the shadow of one of the greatest centers of learning the ancient world had ever produced. A baker kneading dough at dawn, a fisherman mending his nets along the harbor, a mother teaching her daughter to weave. None of these individuals may have ever read a single scroll from the library's vast collection. Yet their labor, their trade, their taxes, and their daily lives formed the quiet foundation upon which such scholarly achievement was able to rest. It is a pattern that repeats throughout history, in nearly every great center of learning, that the visible brilliance of scholars and philosophers depends entirely on the invisible, steady work of ordinary people. And it is worth remembering them as we continue our journey. As the lamps of Alexandria began to glow one by one along its wide streets in the deepening evening. And as the sounds of the busy day gradually softened into the quieter murmur of night, our story now turns back toward the library itself and toward the remarkable individuals who filled its halls in the next segment of our journey together. Let us return now gently to the quiet halls of the Museion and to the scholars who gathered there, drawn from across the Greek-speaking world by the promise of resources, community, and freedom to pursue knowledge that few other places in antiquity could offer. It is through the lives and the careful, patient work of these individuals that the library's true significance becomes clear, not simply as a collection of scrolls, but as a living center of inquiry that shaped the course of human understanding for centuries afterward. One of the earliest and most influential figures associated with the library was Zenodorus of Ephesus, believed by most historians to have served as its first head librarian. Sometime in the early 3rd century BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy the Second, Zenodorus is remembered primarily for his careful editorial work on the texts of Homer, particularly the Iliad and the Odyssey, which held a place of extraordinary cultural importance throughout the Greek world, serving not only as literature, but as a kind of shared cultural foundation, referenced constantly in education, religion, and public life. By the time these texts reached Alexandria, centuries after their original composition, numerous different versions existed, copied and recopied by hand across generations, inevitably introducing small variations, errors, and regional differences in wording. Zenodorus undertook the painstaking task of comparing these different versions against one another, working to establish what he believed to be the most accurate and authoritative text. This kind of comparative textual scholarship, sometimes called philology, was, in many respects, pioneered in its systematic form within the halls of the Alexandrian library, and it would go on to influence textual scholarship for the rest of antiquity and beyond. Zenodorus marked lines he considered questionable or possibly inauthentic with a small symbol in the margin, an early ancestor of the kind of editorial annotation still used by scholars today when working with ancient texts. Following Zenodorus, a succession of other scholars held the position of head librarian, each contributing their own areas of expertise and interest to the library's ongoing work. Among the most significant of these was Callimachus, a poet and scholar originally from Cyrene, a Greek city on the coast of North Africa, not far from Egypt. While it remains debated among historians whether Callimachus ever formally held the title of head librarian, there is little doubt regarding the extraordinary contribution he made to organizing the library's vast and growing collection. We will spend more time with Callimachus and his remarkable cataloging project in our next segment, but it is worth noting here that his work exemplifies the kind of careful, patient dedication that characterized the library's scholarly community throughout this period. Among the scientific minds who found a home within the Museon's walls, few names have endured as prominently as Euclid, whose work on geometry, compiled in a text known as the Elements, would go on to become one of the most influential mathematical works in human history, studied continuously for well over 2,000 years, remaining a foundational text in mathematics education even into relatively recent centuries. Historians generally place Euclid's activity in Alexandria during the early Ptolemaic period, though relatively little is known about his personal life, and even some basic biographical details remain uncertain, since ancient sources discussing Euclid's life were written well after his lifetime and vary somewhat in their reliability. The Elements did not merely present a collection of mathematical facts, but organized geometric knowledge into a systematic structure built from a small set of basic definitions, postulates, and axioms, from which increasingly complex propositions were logically derived and proven, one building carefully upon the last. This method of rigorous logical proof, refined and popularized through Euclid's work, would go on to shape not only mathematics, but broader Western approaches to logical reasoning for millennia afterward. It is a quiet, patient kind of intellectual achievement, built not on sudden inspiration, but on careful, methodical thought, much like the slow, deliberate pace of our journey through this story tonight. Later, in the 3rd century BCE, another remarkable scholar arrived in Alexandria, a man named Eratosthenes, originally from Cyrene as well, who would eventually be appointed head librarian by Ptolemy the Third. Eratosthenes possessed an unusually broad range of interests and expertise, contributing significant work to geography, mathematics, astronomy, and even literary scholarship, earning him the nickname Pentathlos among some of his contemporaries, a reference to the 5-event Greek athletic competition, suggesting a well-rounded excellence across multiple fields rather than singular, narrow mastery. Eratosthenes is perhaps best remembered today for his remarkably accurate calculation of the Earth's circumference, achieved through a method that remains, even by modern standards, an elegant example of careful observation and mathematical reasoning. Having learned that at a certain time of year, at noon, the sun cast no shadow at the bottom of a well in the city of Sin, far to the south along the Nile, Eratosthenes measured the angle of the shadow cast by a vertical object in Alexandria at that same moment. Using the known distance between the two cities, combined with basic geometric principles, he calculated an estimate of the Earth's total circumference. Modern historians debate the precise accuracy of his final figure, partly because the exact ancient unit of measurement he used, the stadion, is not perfectly understood in modern terms. But by most reasonable estimates, Eratosthenes' calculation came remarkably close to the Earth's actual circumference. A genuinely impressive achievement given the tools and knowledge available in his era. Astronomy, too, found fertile ground within the scholarly community of Alexandria, though it is worth noting that much of the era's most significant astronomical work, including that of Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the sun rather than the earth at the center, centuries before Copernicus would revive similar ideas in early modern Europe, occurred in connection with Alexandrian scholarship, even though Aristarchus's own direct association with the library itself is less certain than some of the other figures we have discussed. His heliocentric ideas, remarkable as they were, did not gain wide acceptance among his contemporaries, who largely continued to favor an earth-centered model of the cosmos, a reminder that even brilliant, forward-thinking ideas do not always take hold immediately within their own time. Medicine, too, benefited considerably from the scholarly environment fostered in Alexandria. Physicians such as Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted anatomical studies that, according to several ancient sources, included the dissection of human bodies, a practice that was unusual, and in many other parts of the ancient world considered deeply taboo. Modern historians treat some of the more extreme ancient claims about Alexandrian medical practice, including allegations of vivisection performed on condemned prisoners, with significant skepticism, since such claims appear primarily in later, sometimes hostile sources, and cannot be fully verified. What can be said with more confidence is that Herophilus made genuinely significant advances in understanding human anatomy, including detailed observations of the nervous system and the distinction between arteries and veins, contributing foundational knowledge to the field of medicine that would influence physicians for centuries to come. It is worth taking a moment here to imagine the atmosphere within the Museion during this period, a place where mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, poets, and philosophers lived and worked alongside one another, sharing meals in a common dining hall, walking together along covered colonnades, exchanging ideas across what we might today think of as separate academic disciplines, but which, in the ancient world, were often understood as interconnected branches of a shared pursuit of understanding. A conversation begun over a mathematical proof might drift naturally into questions of astronomy or poetry or the proper interpretation of an ancient text, in a way that modern academic specialization has, in many respects, made less common. The royal patronage that made all of this possible came with certain expectations, of course. Scholars at the Museion were, in some sense, employees of the Ptolemaic court, and their work, particularly early in the institution's history, often served to enhance the prestige and legitimacy of Ptolemaic rule, presenting Alexandria and its royal patrons as worthy successors to the great intellectual traditions of Athens and the wider Greek world. This relationship between scholarship and royal power was not unique to Alexandria, reflecting a broader pattern common throughout much of ancient history, where the pursuit of knowledge and the interests of political power were often closely intertwined, for better and for worse. As we let this segment settle gently toward its close, imagine the quiet satisfaction that must have filled the Museon's halls during these decades, as scholars from across the known world gathered to think, to write, to calculate, and to preserve, supported by the resources of a kingdom that had chosen, quite deliberately, to invest in the pursuit of understanding. In our next segment, we will look more closely at the remarkable work of organizing this vast collection of knowledge through the careful cataloging efforts of Callimachus, whose Pinakes would create something the ancient world had never quite seen before: a systematic guide to the accumulated written knowledge of an entire civilization. As the library's collection grew, scroll by scroll, year by year, across the reigns of successive Ptolemaic kings, a new kind of challenge began to emerge, one that had perhaps never before been faced quite so acutely in human history. How does one organize, catalog, and make accessible a collection of hundreds of thousands of individual scrolls, gathered from dozens of different regions, written in different hands, on different subjects, at different lengths, with no existing precedent to draw upon for how such an undertaking might be accomplished? This was the task that fell, in large part, to Callimachus of Cyrene, whom we met briefly in our previous segment. Callimachus was, by most accounts, primarily known during his own lifetime as a gifted poet, and indeed a significant portion of his surviving literary work reflects a refined, learned style that valued precision and craftsmanship over length or grandeur. A poetic philosophy, sometimes summarized by a phrase attributed to him, suggesting that a great book was, in some sense, a great evil, reflecting his preference for careful, concise composition over sprawling epic works. Yet it is his scholarly, organizational work that has left perhaps the most lasting mark on the history of libraries and information more broadly. Callimachus compiled a monumental work known as the Pinakes, a Greek word that translates roughly to tablets or lists. This was not, historians believe, simply a shelf list or a physical inventory of the library's holdings, but something closer to what we might now call a biographical and bibliographical encyclopedia, organizing the library's vast collection by subject matter and by author, providing brief biographical information about each writer, along with a listing of their known works. The Pinakes, according to ancient references to it, extended across a remarkable 120 scrolls of its own, an indication of just how vast and detailed this organizational undertaking truly was. Let us imagine, for a moment, the sheer patience such a project must have required. Callimachus, and quite likely, a team of assistants working alongside him, would have needed to examine an enormous number of individual scrolls, determine their authorship where possible, note their subject matter, and organize this information into a structure that could actually be used by other scholars seeking to locate specific texts within the library's vast holdings. Texts were organized based on what modern scholars have been able to reconstruct from surviving fragments and later references to the Pinakes, into broad categories, including poetry, further subdivided into genres such as tragedy, comedy, and epic, along with categories for history, oratory, philosophy, medicine, law, and miscellaneous other subjects. This kind of systematic categorization, so familiar to us today in the form of library classification systems, card catalogs, and now digital databases, represented something genuinely new in the ancient world. Before this kind of organized bibliographic work, access to written knowledge depended largely on personal familiarity, on knowing which scholar possessed which text, or relying on informal networks of recommendation and reputation. Callimachus's work, by contrast, created something closer to a searchable index, allowing a scholar arriving in Alexandria, perhaps for the first time, to locate relevant texts on a given subject without needing to already possess extensive prior knowledge of what the library contained. It is worth pausing here gently to consider how this kind of organizational achievement, though perhaps less immediately dramatic than a mathematical proof or an astronomical calculation, represents its own quiet form of genius. The ability to organize vast quantities of information in a way that makes it genuinely usable by others is a skill easily overlooked, yet one that has proven, across the long span of human history, to be just as essential to the advancement of knowledge as the original creative or scientific work itself. Without careful organization, even the largest collection of knowledge remains, in a practical sense, largely inaccessible, its contents scattered and unknown even to those who might benefit most from consulting them. The Pinakes itself, unfortunately, did not survive into the modern era, lost along with the vast majority of the library's own collection, a loss we will discuss more fully as our story continues. What we know of it today comes primarily from references and quotations preserved in the works of later ancient writers, who consulted the Pinakes themselves before its eventual loss, and who found it valuable enough to cite and describe in their own writings, giving modern historians at least a partial window into a work that was, by any reasonable measure, a landmark achievement in the history of organized knowledge. Beyond the broad cataloging work of the Pinakes, the library's scholars also engaged in careful, ongoing textual criticism, a practice we touched upon briefly when discussing Xenodotus's work on Homer. This tradition continued and deepened under later librarians, including Aristophanes of Byzantium, who served as head librarian in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE. Aristophanes, made significant contributions to the study of Greek literary texts, including further refinements to the established texts of Homer and other classical Greek authors, as well as innovations in the study of the Greek language itself, including early work on systems of accentuation and punctuation intended to help readers, particularly those for whom Greek was not a native language, better understand how ancient texts should be read aloud, a genuinely practical concern, given how much ancient literature was intended to be read or performed vocally rather than silently, as much modern reading tends to be. This attention to the practical accessibility of texts reflects something important about the broader mission of the library and the Museion during this period. While the institution certainly served the interests and prestige of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and while access to its resources was, in practice, limited primarily to a relatively small community of invited scholars rather than the general public, the underlying intellectual project, the careful preservation, organization, and refinement of accumulated human knowledge, represented a genuinely significant contribution to the broader trajectory of scholarship and learning that would continue to influence later civilizations for centuries after the library itself had faded into memory. Succeeding Aristophanes as head librarian was Aristarchus of Samothrace, not to be confused with the earlier astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, whom we discussed in our previous segment. This later Aristarchus continued the tradition of careful textual scholarship, particularly in relation to Homeric texts, and is remembered as one of the most respected and influential textual critics of the ancient world. His editorial judgments on Homeric passages continuing to be referenced and respected by later scholars for generations after his own lifetime. As we consider the cumulative achievement of these successive generations of librarians and scholars, working patiently across more than a century, it becomes clear that the Library of Alexandria's true significance rested not merely in the size of its collection, impressive as that undoubtedly was, but in the careful, systematic intellectual labor that scholars like Callimachus, Xenodotus, Aristophanes, and Aristarchus of Samothrace poured into organizing, refining, and preserving that collection for the benefit of scholarship, both in their own time and through the texts and traditions they helped establish for centuries to come. Let us allow this segment to settle gently now, imagining the quiet halls of the library in these years, shelves upon shelves of carefully labeled scrolls, each bearing a small tag identifying its author and subject, a system made possible by the patient organizational genius of scholars who understood that knowledge, however vast, is only truly valuable when it can be found, understood, and shared. In our next segment, we will turn our attention to the wider Ptolemaic dynasty itself, exploring how successive kings continued, expanded, and sometimes complicated the legacy of patronage, that had given rise to this remarkable institution in the first place. Let us turn our attention now to the wider dynasty that made the library's existence possible in the first place. Following the Ptolemaic kings across the generations, as their patronage shaped, sustained, and eventually complicated the institution's long history. It is a gentle reminder that great centers of learning, however timeless their contributions might feel to us today, are always, in practice, deeply tied to the political and economic fortunes of the societies that support them. We have already spoken of Ptolemy the First, the general who first envisioned a great center of learning in his newly claimed kingdom, and of his son, Ptolemy the Second, known as Philadelphus, under whose reign the library and Museion appear to have reached their fullest early institutional form. Ptolemy the Second's reign, spanning roughly from 285 to 246 BCE, is generally regarded by historians as something of a golden age for Ptolemaic Egypt more broadly, a period of relative stability, considerable wealth, and active royal investment in cultural and intellectual projects. Ptolemy II is remembered not only for his patronage of the library, but for a range of other significant undertakings that reflected the broader ambitions of his reign. He oversaw considerable expansion and reconstruction related to the Lighthouse of Alexandria, that great structure built on the island of Pharos, which had likely been begun under his father, but which reached its completed, iconic form during his own reign. This lighthouse, standing perhaps well over 100 meters tall, according to various ancient descriptions, though exact figures vary across sources, would go on to be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its light, produced by a fire at its summit, and reportedly amplified through some arrangement of reflective surfaces, guiding ships safely into Alexandria's busy harbors for centuries. The relationship between the lighthouse and the library, though they served entirely different practical purposes, one guiding ships and the other guiding minds, reflects something meaningful about the character of Ptolemaic Alexandria as a whole, a city that sought to establish itself, quite deliberately, as a wonder of the ancient world in multiple dimensions at once, both in its physical grandeur and in its intellectual achievement. Following Ptolemy II, his son Ptolemy III, known as Euergetes, meaning benefactor, continued the family's tradition of supporting the library, and it was under his reign, as we mentioned in our previous segment, that Eratosthenes was appointed head librarian. Ptolemy III is associated with several accounts, treated with varying degrees of historical confidence, regarding further efforts to expand the library's collection, including a famous, though difficult to verify with complete certainty, story concerning the borrowing of official Athenian texts of the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. According to this account, preserved in later ancient sources, Ptolemy III requested to borrow Athens's official, carefully preserved copies of these tragedians' works, offering a substantial financial deposit as guarantee of their safe return, with the ostensible purpose of having them copied for the Alexandrian collection. Having received the original texts, the story continues. Ptolemy chose to keep the originals for the library, sending back only copies to Athens and forfeiting the deposit as, in effect, payment for the originals he retained. Historians treat this account with some caution, recognizing it as a colorful anecdote that may contain a kernel of truth regarding the aggressive, determined manner in which the Ptolemaic kings pursued valuable texts. Even if the precise details cannot be fully verified through independent evidence, it is worth pausing here to reflect on what these anecdotes, whether entirely accurate in every detail or not, tell us about the character of Ptolemaic ambition regarding the library. These were not passive collectors, content to accept whatever texts happened to arrive through ordinary trade and donation. They were, by most accounts, active, sometimes even ethically questionable, pursuers of knowledge, willing to use the considerable resources and influence of their kingdom to acquire texts they considered valuable, reflecting a genuine, deeply held belief in the importance of what they were building. As the Ptolemaic dynasty continued through subsequent generations, the quality and stability of royal patronage for the library appears, based on available historical evidence, to have become somewhat less consistent. Later Ptolemaic rulers faced increasing internal political instability, including several periods of civil conflict within the royal family itself, as well as growing external pressure from the rising power of Rome, which would eventually come to dominate the entire Mediterranean world, including Egypt itself. One incident from this later, more turbulent period deserves particular mention, involving Ptolemy the Eighth, sometimes referred to by the somewhat unflattering nickname Fiskin, whose reign in the latter half of the 2nd century BCE was marked by significant internal political conflict. According to several ancient sources, tensions during this period led to a considerable exodus of scholars from Alexandria, some driven out amid political purges associated with succession disputes within the royal family. This scattering of scholars, whatever its precise causes and extent, is sometimes credited by historians with helping to spread Alexandrian scholarly methods and traditions to other parts of the Mediterranean world. As displaced scholars carried their training and expertise to new cities and new patrons, an unintended but historically significant consequence of what was, at the time, likely experienced as a genuine disruption and loss for the Alexandrian scholarly community itself. Despite these periods of instability, the library appears to have continued functioning in some capacity through much of the remaining Ptolemaic period, even as the dynasty's political fortunes grew increasingly precarious. The final and perhaps most historically famous ruler of the Ptolemaic line was Cleopatra VII, whose reign, ending with her death in 30 BCE, marked the conclusion of nearly 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule over Egypt and the beginning of direct Roman control over the country. Cleopatra herself, based on various ancient accounts, was reputed to be a genuinely learned individual, said by some sources to have been fluent in multiple languages, and to have taken a personal interest in scholarship and intellectual pursuits, consistent with the long-standing Ptolemaic tradition of royal patronage for learning. Even as the practical political and military circumstances of her reign grew increasingly difficult, it was during Cleopatra's reign, and specifically during the political and military conflict that brought Julius Caesar to Alexandria in 48 BCE, that the library experienced what many historians regard as its first major, well-documented crisis, an event we will examine carefully in a later segment of our journey together. Before we turn toward that more difficult chapter of the story, however, let us take a moment to appreciate the remarkable span of time across which Ptolemaic patronage sustained the library and its associated scholarly community, roughly from the early 3rd century BCE through the final decades before the Common Era. A period of nearly 300 years during which Alexandria remained, almost continuously, one of the preeminent centers of learning in the entire ancient world, a legacy few institutions in human history have managed to match in duration or influence. It is worth remembering, too, as we consider this long dynastic history, that the library's survival and continued function depended not merely on the personal interests or generosity of individual kings, but on more structural factors as well, including Egypt's considerable agricultural wealth, generated by the reliable, fertile flooding of the Nile, which provided the Ptolemaic treasury with the resources necessary to sustain not only the library itself, but the broader infrastructure of Alexandria as a whole, its harbors, its markets, its administration, and its diverse, cosmopolitan population. In this sense, the story of the library is inseparable from the story of Egypt's ancient agricultural abundance. A quiet reminder that even the loftiest intellectual achievements of human civilization tend to rest, ultimately, on the more humble, practical foundations of food, trade, and stable governance. As this segment draws gently toward its close, let us allow the long sweep of Ptolemaic history to settle quietly in our minds. Generations of kings and queens, some more devoted to scholarship than others, some more politically stable than others, all connected by a shared inheritance from Ptolemy, the First's original vision of a great center of learning beside the sea. In our next segment, we will step back once more into the quieter, more intimate world of the library's daily operations, exploring the practical craft of papyrus making, the discipline of the scriptorium, and the quiet, patient labor of the many individuals whose careful work, day after day, kept the library's vast collection alive and growing. Let us slow down now gently and turn our attention to the quiet, patient craft that made the library's entire existence possible in the first place. The humble, practical work of producing the material on which nearly all of its vast collection was written. Papyrus, the material from which most ancient scrolls were made, deserves its own careful consideration, since without it, the library's collection, however brilliant the minds behind it, would have had no physical form at all. Papyrus was made from a tall, reed-like plant that grew abundantly along the marshy edges of the Nile and in the shallow waters of Lake Merodes, just beside Alexandria itself. Another quiet geographical advantage that had helped make the city such a natural home for a great center of writing and scholarship. The plant's stalk, once harvested, would be carefully cut into thin strips. These strips were laid side by side in a single layer. Then a second layer was placed perpendicular to the first, the two layers overlapping in a careful cross-hatched pattern. This double layer of plant strips was then pressed, often under considerable weight, and allowed to dry. The plant's own natural sap, released during this pressing process, acted as a kind of adhesive, binding the layers together into a single, relatively smooth sheet. Once dried, the sheet's surface would be polished, often using a smooth stone or a piece of shell, creating a writing surface suitable for ink. Individual sheets were then joined together, edge to edge, into long rolls, which could then be wound around a wooden rod at one or both ends, forming the finished scroll. The production of papyrus on the scale required to supply not only the library, but the broader administrative, commercial, and literary needs of the entire Ptolemaic kingdom, and indeed much of the wider Mediterranean world, since papyrus was a major Egyptian export throughout antiquity, would have required a substantial and organized industry, employing many workers across various stages of harvesting, processing, and finishing. This entire industry, though far less celebrated in historical memory than the scholars who used its final product, deserves genuine appreciation as an essential foundation of the library's existence. Once a blank papyrus scroll was ready, the work of the scribe would begin. We touched briefly in an earlier segment on the basic process of copying texts, but let us slow down further here and consider this work in fuller detail, since the scriptorium, the space where such copying took place, represented the true daily heartbeat of the library's ongoing operation. A scribe would typically sit, based on artistic depictions and physical evidence from the broader ancient Mediterranean world, with a scroll unrolled across the lap, or upon a low writing table, using a reed pen cut to a fine point, dipped periodically into ink, prepared from a mixture of soot, gum, and water, producing the characteristic dark, carbon-based ink common throughout much of ancient writing. Some texts, particularly those intended for more decorative or formal purposes, might incorporate red ink as well, prepared from a different mineral base, used to highlight titles, section breaks, or other significant elements within a text. Greek writing during this period was typically composed in a continuous script without spaces between words, a practice that modern readers, accustomed to clearly separated words and punctuation, might find surprisingly demanding to read. This meant that both the writing and the reading of ancient texts required a level of skill and familiarity with the language considerably beyond simple literacy in the most basic sense, since a reader needed to mentally parse where one word ended and the next began, based on context and familiarity with common patterns of Greek grammar and vocabulary. Given this demand, the scribes who worked within the library's scriptorium were themselves valued, skilled professionals, and the accuracy of their copying work carried real significance for the broader scholarly mission of the institution. An error introduced during copying, whether a misread letter, a skipped line, or an unintentional alteration, could, if left uncorrected, propagate through subsequent copies made from that flawed version, gradually corrupting the transmission of a text over time. This is precisely why the careful editorial and comparative work of scholars like Xenodotus and Aristarchus of Samothrace, comparing multiple copies of a text against one another to identify and correct such errors, held such genuine importance for the broader project of preserving ancient literature accurately. It is worth imagining, for a moment, the quiet atmosphere of the scriptorium itself during ordinary working hours. Rows of scribes seated at their tables, the soft, steady sound of reed pens moving across papyrus, the occasional low murmur of conversation as a scribe consulted a supervising scholar about an unclear passage in the original text being copied, sunlight filtering in through windows or open colonnades, since ancient writing spaces typically relied on natural light during the hours when writing was most commonly done, artificial lamplight being less well suited to the fine, careful work of copying text accurately. Beyond the more famous scholarly figures we have discussed across previous segments, it is worth remembering the many, largely anonymous scribes whose careful, patient labor formed the essential, ongoing foundation of the library's continued existence and growth. These individuals, whose names have, in the vast majority of cases, been lost entirely to history, nonetheless performed work of genuine and lasting significance, since it was through their hands, quite literally, that so much of ancient literature and scholarship was preserved and transmitted to later generations. The scrolls produced through this careful process required proper storage and handling as well, since papyrus, while reasonably durable under the right conditions, remained vulnerable to moisture, insects, and general wear over time. Ancient sources suggest that scrolls within the library were stored in wooden cases or on shelving specifically designed to hold them horizontally, with identifying tags called syllaboi in Greek, attached to the outer edge of each scroll, allowing a scholar browsing the shelves to identify a scroll's author and subject without needing to fully unroll it. A practical innovation that reflects the same organizational spirit we discussed in relation to Callimachus's broader cataloging project. Alexandria's climate, while generally milder than much of Egypt's deeper desert regions, still presented certain preservation challenges, and historians believe that ongoing maintenance, involving the periodic recopying of scrolls that had begun to deteriorate through age or damage, would have been a continuous, necessary part of the library's operation. Another quiet but essential task that helped ensure the long-term survival of its collection across the generations. Beyond the practical craft of papyrus production and scribal copying, it is worth briefly considering the broader economic and logistical infrastructure that supported the library's daily operation. The stipends provided to resident scholars, the wages paid to scribes and other workers, the ongoing supply of papyrus, ink, and other materials, all required careful administration and a steady flow of resources from the royal treasury, itself supported by the broader agricultural and commercial wealth of Ptolemaic Egypt that we discussed in our previous segment. In this sense, the quiet, scholarly work happening within the library's walls remained, throughout its history, deeply connected to the practical realities of governance, trade, and agriculture that sustained the wider kingdom. As we let this segment settle gently toward its conclusion, consider the layered, patient chain of labor that stood behind every single scroll housed within the library's collection. Farmers cultivating papyrus reeds along the Nile's marshy banks, workers processing those reeds into finished sheets, scribes carefully copying text after text, scholars reviewing and correcting those copies for accuracy, and administrators ensuring that resources continued flowing steadily to support this entire, quiet, remarkable enterprise. It is a reminder that even the loftiest achievements of human scholarship rest, always, on countless hours of careful, often unglamorous labor, performed by people whose names history has, for the most part, quietly forgotten. In our next segment, we will turn to consider some of the broader intellectual currents that flowed through Alexandria during this period, exploring how the library's scholarly community engaged not only with Greek intellectual traditions, but with the wisdom of Egypt, of Babylon, and of other cultures across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, weaving together a genuinely cross-cultural tradition of learning that reflected Alexandria's unique position as a meeting point between civilizations. As our journey continues through the quiet history of the Library of Alexandria, let us pause to consider something that made this particular center of learning genuinely distinctive among the great intellectual traditions of the ancient world. Its position at the meeting point of multiple, deeply established civilizations, each bringing its own long history of knowledge, philosophy, and practice into contact. and in many cases, productive exchange with one another. Egypt itself, of course, possessed an intellectual and religious tradition stretching back thousands of years before Alexander ever arrived on its shores, encompassing sophisticated systems of astronomy tied closely to religious practice and the practical needs of predicting the Nile's annual flood, advanced mathematical knowledge applied to architecture and land surveying, and a medical tradition that, while different in its underlying theoretical framework from later Greek medicine, included genuinely careful empirical observation, some of which is preserved in surviving Egyptian medical papyri, predating the Ptolemaic period by many centuries. The relationship between this ancient Egyptian intellectual tradition and the newer Greek scholarly community established under Ptolemaic patronage was complex, and historians continue to discuss and debate the precise nature and extent of their interaction and mutual influence. Some evidence suggests that Egyptian priests, who maintained their own long tradition of astronomical observation and record-keeping within temple institutions, may have shared certain knowledge and observational data with Greek scholars working in Alexandria, though the degree of direct, systematic collaboration between these two intellectual communities remains an area of ongoing scholarly discussion, complicated by the linguistic and cultural distance between Greek and Egyptian scholarly traditions, and by the relatively limited surviving evidence that would allow historians to reconstruct these interactions with full confidence. One figure who exemplifies this cross-cultural intellectual exchange, at least to some degree, was Manetho, an Egyptian priest who, during the early Ptolemaic period, wrote a history of Egypt in Greek, drawing on native Egyptian records and traditions to present Egypt's long dynastic history to a Greek-reading audience. While Manetho's original work has not survived in complete form, existing only through later quotations and summaries preserved by other ancient writers, it represents a significant example of Egyptian knowledge being deliberately translated and presented within the broader Hellenistic intellectual world that Alexandria's library and Museion helped to foster and sustain. Similarly, as we discussed in an earlier segment, the translation of Jewish scripture into Greek, producing what became known as the Septuagint, reflects Alexandria's role as a genuine meeting point between Greek and Jewish intellectual and religious tradition. Alexandria's large and well-established Jewish community engaged actively with the broader intellectual life of the city, and in later centuries, this cross-cultural engagement would produce further significant figures, including the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived somewhat later than the main period of our story, in the early 1st century of the Common Era, but whose work represents a continuation of this same tradition of intellectual exchange between Greek philosophical thought and Jewish religious and scriptural tradition, attempting, in his writings, to demonstrate compatibility and even deep harmony between these two distinct intellectual inheritances. Babylonian astronomical knowledge, too, appears to have made its way into the broader intellectual currents flowing through Alexandria. Though again, the precise pathways and extent of this influence remain subjects of ongoing historical and scholarly investigation. Babylonian astronomers had, over many centuries preceding the Hellenistic period, developed sophisticated mathematical methods for predicting celestial events, including eclipses and planetary movements, based on careful, long-term observational records. Some of this Babylonian mathematical astronomical tradition appears to have influenced later Greek astronomy, including work associated with Hipparchus, an astronomer whose exact relationship to Alexandria itself is debated among historians. Though his work certainly formed part of the broader Hellenistic astronomical tradition that Alexandrian scholars both contributed to and drew upon. It is worth pausing here gently to reflect on what this genuine, if imperfectly documented, cross-cultural exchange tells us about the nature of intellectual progress more broadly. Knowledge, throughout human history, has rarely developed in complete isolation, contained neatly within the boundaries of a single culture or tradition. Instead, it has tended to grow most richly at points of contact and exchange between different peoples, different languages, and different ways of understanding the world, each bringing its own accumulated insight into productive conversation with others. Alexandria, by virtue of its geography and the deliberate cosmopolitan character fostered by Ptolemaic patronage, became one of the ancient world's most significant such points of contact, a place where Greek philosophical rigor, Egyptian astronomical and medical tradition, Jewish religious and scriptural scholarship, and Babylonian mathematical astronomy could all, to varying degrees, meet and mingle within the shared intellectual community sustained by the library and the Museion. This is not to suggest, of course, that Alexandria's intellectual community was somehow free of the cultural hierarchies and biases common throughout the ancient world more broadly. Greek intellectual and literary tradition generally held a position of particular prestige within the Ptolemaic court and the Museion itself, and non-Greek knowledge, however genuinely valuable, was often filtered through Greek language and Greek intellectual frameworks before finding its way into the library's collection and the broader scholarly conversation happening within its halls. Historians today try to hold both of these realities in mind simultaneously. The genuine, remarkable cross-cultural exchange that Alexandria fostered, alongside the real cultural hierarchies and power imbalances that shaped how and whose knowledge was recorded, translated, and preserved. Philosophy, too, flourished within this cosmopolitan environment, though it is worth noting that Alexandria, for much of the library's early history, was perhaps somewhat less central to the mainstream development of Greek philosophical schools than cities like Athens remained throughout this period. Nonetheless, Alexandria did produce and host significant philosophical activity, and in later centuries, particularly following the establishment of Roman rule over Egypt, Alexandria would become an increasingly important center for various philosophical movements, including early Christian theological scholarship, which drew, in various ways, on the broader Greek philosophical tradition that Alexandria's long intellectual history had helped sustain and develop within the region. Let us also take a moment to consider the more everyday, less formally documented forms of cultural exchange that surely occurred constantly within Alexandria's busy, diverse streets, beyond the more rarefied halls of the Museion itself. Merchants trading goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond would have exchanged not only material goods, but stories, customs, and practical knowledge as well. Religious festivals celebrated by Alexandria's various communities sometimes drew participants and observers from beyond their own particular cultural or religious group, contributing to a broader, shared urban culture that, while never erasing the real distinctions between Alexandria's various communities, nonetheless fostered a genuine sense of shared civic life and identity among the city's remarkably diverse population. As we allow this segment to settle gently toward its conclusion, consider Alexandria not simply as a repository of scrolls, however impressive that collection undoubtedly was, but as a genuinely living, breathing meeting point of human cultures and traditions, where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other intellectual inheritances found themselves, for a few remarkable centuries, in sustained and often productive contact with one another, supported by the patient, deliberate patronage of a dynasty that had chosen, quite consciously, to make the pursuit and preservation of knowledge a central pillar of its own royal legitimacy and prestige. In our next segment, we will turn our attention toward a more difficult period in this long story, examining the political and military upheavals that began to affect Alexandria as Roman power grew increasingly dominant across the Mediterranean world, and considering, with appropriate historical care, the first major crisis to affect the library itself, an event connected to the arrival of Julius Caesar in Alexandria during the tumultuous final decades of the 1st century BCE. Our story now turns, gently and without alarm, toward a more difficult chapter, one that involves loss and gradual decline. We will walk through it slowly and calmly, as we have walked through every other part of this long history, because even difficult history deserves to be told with patience and care, rather than drama or distress. There is nothing here that requires urgency. We are simply continuing to observe, from a comfortable distance across many centuries, the way that even great and enduring institutions eventually change, and in time fade. In the year 48 BCE, the Roman general Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. Drawn into the complex political situation of Ptolemaic Egypt during a period of civil conflict between Cleopatra VII and her brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy the 13th. Caesar, already deeply involved in his own political and military struggles within the wider Roman world, found himself, for a time, besieged within the palace district of Alexandria by forces loyal to Ptolemy the 13th. During this siege, according to several ancient sources, including accounts referenced by later historians such as Plutarch, a fire broke out in the harbor area of the city, reportedly started or spread in connection with Caesar's own forces setting fire to ships in the harbor to prevent them from falling into the hands of his opponents. This fire, according to some ancient accounts, spread from the harbor area into parts of the city itself, and several ancient sources suggest that it damaged or destroyed a significant quantity of books, possibly including materials stored near the harbor, potentially connected to the library's broader holdings, since some ancient accounts suggest that overflow storage or materials awaiting processing may have been kept in warehouses closer to the harbor rather than exclusively within the main library building itself. It is important here to speak with appropriate historical care, because the popular, widely repeated story that Caesar's fire completely destroyed the entire Library of Alexandria in a single catastrophic event is now regarded by most modern historians as a significant oversimplification, and in its most dramatic forms, largely inaccurate. Ancient sources themselves offer varying and sometimes contradictory accounts of the fire's actual extent and impact. Some sources suggest a limited, though still regrettable, loss of books, likely from storage areas near the harbor, rather than a complete destruction of the main library and Museion complex. Other later, sometimes more embellished sources present a more dramatic picture of near total loss, though these accounts were often written considerably later and may reflect a tendency toward dramatic simplification common in ancient historical writing, particularly among writers seeking to create a memorable, morally significant narrative rather than a strictly precise, factual account. What seems most consistent with the balance of surviving evidence, according to the careful assessment of modern historians who have studied this question closely, is that the fire of 48 BCE did cause some genuine loss of books and materials, representing a real, regrettable setback, but that the library and Museion, as broader institutions, continued to exist and function in some capacity for a considerable period afterward, meaning that the popular image of a single, sudden, complete destruction does not accurately reflect the more gradual, complex reality of the library's eventual decline across subsequent centuries. Following this incident, historical evidence suggests, though with the same appropriate caution regarding incomplete ancient sources that has characterized so much of our story, that the Museion, and at least a reduced version of the library's collection, continued to function under subsequent Roman rule. Following Egypt's formal incorporation into the Roman Empire after Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the Roman emperors, in general, continued a degree of patronage toward Alexandria's scholarly institutions. Though most historians agree that the scale, prestige, and perhaps the overall vitality of the institution gradually diminished across the following centuries compared to its height under the earlier, most actively engaged Ptolemaic kings. Alexandria itself, however, remained a significant and vibrant intellectual center for a considerable period, even after this gradual institutional decline began, continuing to attract scholars and to host significant intellectual activity across the early centuries of the Common Era, including, as we mentioned in our previous segment, becoming an important center for early Christian theological scholarship, alongside continued activity in mathematics, medicine, and other fields, carried forward by later scholars who, whatever the exact institutional status of the original Museion and library by this point, continued to draw on and contribute to the broader intellectual traditions that Alexandria had fostered since its earliest Ptolemaic centuries. A separate, related institution deserves mention here as well: the Temple of Serapis, known as the Serapeum, which we briefly discussed in an earlier segment concerning Alexandria's religious life. Some ancient sources suggest that the Serapeum housed a secondary collection of texts, sometimes described as a kind of daughter library to the main library associated with the Museion. Though the precise relationship and relative scale of this secondary collection compared to the original library remains a matter of some historical uncertainty, the Serapeum itself met a significant and well-documented end in the year 391 of the Common Era, when, amid escalating religious tensions between Alexandria's Christian and pagan communities during this later period of Roman and increasingly Christian imperial rule, the temple was destroyed, an event connected to a broader edict from the Roman Emperor Theodosius, the first ordering the closure of pagan temples across the empire. Historical sources describe this destruction as part of a broader pattern of religious conflict occurring throughout the late Roman world during this period, a genuinely significant event in its own right, reflecting the profound religious transformation occurring across the Mediterranean world as Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Whether or to what extent any remaining books housed at the Serapeum were lost during this destruction remains debated among historians, since ancient sources describing this event focus primarily on the religious and architectural significance of the temple's destruction, rather than providing detailed accounts of any library materials that may have been present. By this later period, several centuries after the library's original founding, most historians agree that whatever remained of the original grand vision established by Ptolemy the First had already diminished considerably from its earlier heights, shaped by a long, gradual process involving multiple contributing factors across the centuries, rather than any single dramatic destructive event. These factors likely included periods of political instability and reduced royal or imperial patronage, the gradual physical deterioration of scrolls that were not consistently maintained or recopied, occasional damage from fires, civil unrest, or military conflict occurring at various points across Alexandria's long history, and broader shifts in the centers of intellectual and cultural activity across the late antique Mediterranean world, as other cities, including Constantinople following its establishment as the new capital of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, began to draw scholarly attention and resources that had once flowed more exclusively toward Alexandria. It is worth pausing here gently to reflect on how this more gradual, multifaceted historical reality, involving centuries of slow change rather than a single, dramatic catastrophe, is in some ways a more fitting, and perhaps a more universally resonant way to understand the library's eventual decline. Institutions, like individual human lives, rarely end in a single, clean, decisive moment. More often, they fade gradually, shaped by countless small decisions, circumstances, and changes accumulating slowly across time, until, at some point difficult to pinpoint precisely, what once existed in its fullest form has quietly become something smaller, or has faded away entirely, leaving behind only traces, memories, and the enduring influence of what it once contributed to the wider world. As we allow this segment to settle gently toward its close, let us hold both truths together with appropriate historical care: that the Library of Alexandria did experience genuine, real losses across its long history, including the fire connected to Caesar's arrival in 48 BCE, and the later destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, and that its eventual fading from prominence unfolded gradually across centuries, rather than in a single catastrophic moment, shaped by a complex combination of political, religious, and cultural changes occurring across the broader late antique Mediterranean world. In our final segment, before we turn to a quiet, reflective conclusion, we will consider what, if anything, survived from this remarkable institution, and what its long, patient legacy has meant for the centuries of human learning that followed in its wake. As our long journey through the history of the Library of Alexandria draws toward its final, quiet chapter tonight, let us turn our attention gently toward the question of legacy, considering what, in the end, this remarkable institution actually gave to the wider world, beyond the physical scrolls that, for the most part, did not survive into our own time. It is true, and worth acknowledging honestly and without excessive sorrow, that the vast majority of the library's original collection has been lost to us. The precise texts that once filled its shelves, the specific works of poetry, history, philosophy, and science that scholars like Zenodus, Callimachus, and Aristarchus of Samothrace once studied, copied, and refined, exist for us today, in most cases, only as fragments, references, or complete absences, known to us only through the citations and summaries preserved by later ancient writers who had the fortune of consulting these works before their eventual loss. And yet, this honest acknowledgement of loss should not overshadow the genuine and lasting significance of what the library did, in fact, contribute to the broader trajectory of human knowledge, much of which survived and continued to shape scholarship for centuries afterward, not through the physical preservation of every original scroll, but through the methods, the texts that were successfully copied and transmitted onward, and the broader intellectual traditions that Alexandria's scholarly community helped to establish and refine. Consider, for instance, the survival of Euclid's Elements, which we discussed in an earlier segment. This foundational mathematical text, refined and organized during Euclid's time in Alexandria, was successfully copied and transmitted across the centuries, surviving not through the preservation of the original Alexandrian scrolls themselves, which did not survive, but through the ongoing chain of careful copying and recopying that continued across the Byzantine world, and later through Arabic translations that preserved and further developed Greek mathematical and scientific knowledge during the medieval period, eventually returning to Western Europe through Latin translations that helped fuel the revival of mathematical and scientific study during the later medieval and early modern periods. In this sense, Euclid's work, first organized and refined within the halls of the Alexandrian Museion, continued to shape mathematical education for well over 2,000 years. A legacy that reaches, in a real and direct sense, into classrooms, even in relatively recent history. Similarly, the careful philological methods pioneered by Alexandrian scholars, the comparative textual criticism developed by figures like Zenodus and Aristarchus of Samothrace in their careful study of Homer, established approaches to textual scholarship that continued to influence how scholars across subsequent centuries approached the careful preservation and interpretation of ancient texts, an intellectual methodology whose influence extends, in a meaningful sense, into the modern academic disciplines of classical philology and textual criticism that continue to be practiced by scholars today. The broader model that Alexandria established of a state-supported institution bringing together scholars from diverse backgrounds, providing them with resources and community to pursue sustained, collaborative intellectual work, also represents a significant and lasting contribution to the broader history of human learning. While the specific institutional form of the Museion did not survive in unbroken continuity into the modern era, the basic concept it embodied, that organized societies benefit from deliberately investing resources into supporting scholarship, and the preservation of knowledge would be echoed and reimagined many times across subsequent centuries. From the great libraries and centers of learning established during the medieval Islamic world, including the renowned House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which similarly gathered scholars and texts from across a wide, diverse cultural and linguistic range, to the universities that gradually emerged across medieval Europe, to the modern research universities, national libraries, and archives that continue to preserve and advance human knowledge in our own time. It is worth pausing here gently to consider this longer arc of continuity, stretching from ancient Alexandria through medieval centers of learning to the institutions we know today. Though the specific scrolls housed within the Library of Alexandria have, for the most part, been lost to us, the underlying idea that gave rise to the library in the first place, that knowledge deserves to be gathered, organized, preserved, and shared, that scholars benefit from community and support in pursuing sustained intellectual work, that a society's investment in learning represents a genuine and worthwhile use of its collective resources, has proven remarkably durable, echoing forward across more than 2,000 years of subsequent human history, right up to the quiet libraries, universities, and archives that continue this same basic mission in our own present day. It is also worth remembering, as we bring this long story toward its gentle close, the many individuals whose quiet, patient labor made the library's achievements possible. Individuals whose names, in the vast majority of cases, have been lost entirely to history. The scribes who carefully copied scroll after scroll, the papyrus workers who processed the plant harvested along the Nile's marshy banks, the countless ordinary Alexandrians whose labor and trade sustained the wider city, and through it, the resources that flowed toward supporting the library and its scholarly community. Their contribution, though rarely recorded individually in the surviving historical record, remains, in a very real sense, woven into the broader legacy of everything the library achieved and preserved. Modern Alexandria, it is worth noting gently before we close, has itself embraced this long historical legacy in a meaningful, contemporary way. In the year 2002, a new library called the Bibliotheca Alexandrina was opened in the city, built near the approximate location of the ancient library's original site. Though the precise location of the original building remains a subject of ongoing archaeological investigation and some uncertainty, since much of ancient Alexandria's coastal architecture has, over the many centuries since antiquity, been affected by subsidence, changing coastlines, and centuries of subsequent building activity. This new library, a genuinely striking piece of modern architecture, was built as a deliberate, symbolic continuation of the ancient institution's mission, gathering books and resources once again in Alexandria, and standing today as a living reminder of the enduring importance of the vision first held so many centuries ago by Ptolemy the First and the generations of scholars, scribes, and patrons who sustained his original vision across the many centuries that followed. As we allow this final segment, and indeed our entire long journey together tonight, to settle gently toward its close, let us take a moment to hold the whole sweep of this story quietly in mind. A young conqueror pausing beside a quiet stretch of Egyptian coastline, a general turned king, shaped by years alongside philosophers and scholars, choosing to invest his new kingdom's resources into the deliberate pursuit of knowledge. Generations of scribes, patiently copying text after text by lamplight and daylight. Scholars from across the ancient Mediterranean world, gathering in shared halls to calculate the size of the earth, to trace the movements of the stars, to carefully compare different versions of ancient poetry in search of the most accurate reading, to translate sacred texts between languages, to organize hundreds of thousands of scrolls into a system that made this vast collection of knowledge genuinely usable by others. And beyond the walls of the Museion itself, an entire living city, bakers and fishermen, weavers and glassmakers, families gathering for evening meals as lamps were lit along wide, orderly streets. A genuinely diverse population from across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, living together, trading together, and quietly sustaining, through their ordinary daily labor, one of the most remarkable centers of learning the ancient world would ever produce. Much of what that great institution once held has been lost to us, scattered across the long centuries by fire, by neglect, by the simple, gradual passage of time that eventually touches every human institution, however grand. And yet, something genuine and lasting did survive, carried forward not in the original scrolls themselves, but in the ideas, the methods, and the enduring example of what a society can achieve when it chooses, deliberately and patiently, to invest in the pursuit and preservation of knowledge. Let your breathing continue to slow now, gently, as we let this long story settle quietly into rest. Somewhere along that ancient coastline, where the Nile once met the sea, where lamps once burned late into the night above rows of carefully copied scrolls, the quiet work of remembering the world once continued patiently for centuries. And in listening tonight, in this quiet, comfortable moment, you have carried a small part of that same long, patient tradition forward, simply by resting here and allowing this old, gentle story to accompany you toward sleep. And so, gently, our journey tonight comes to rest. There is nothing more you need to hold on to, nothing to remember, no names or dates to carry forward into tomorrow. The story of Alexandria and its quiet library of scrolls will still be here whenever you wish to return to it, resting patiently, the way old stories always do. For now, let the sound of this voice grow softer, and let the picture of that ancient harbor, its lamps glowing gently along the water, its scrolls resting quietly on their shelves fade slowly into the darkness behind your closed eyes. There is nowhere left to go tonight, and nothing left to do. Only rest, only quiet, only the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you gently now toward sleep.